Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest in the Insight series online. We're really honoured to be joined by Dr. Sally Augustin, an environmental psychologist, also runs her own organisation called Design with Science. Today's subject, designing for every user, neurodiversity in the workplace. This has had a lot of attention. The event is being recorded, so if you think it's that great, you can share it with others as well. Sally, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm Sally Augustin, and I'm an applied environmental psychologist. And most of you probably haven't met an environmental psychologist, so I'll tell you a little bit about, what I do. I make science-based, design-related recommendations to people developing places or objects and services worldwide. So what does that really mean? I talk to people about things like how high the ceiling should be to put people in a particular emotional state, or what people should feel under their feet as they walk through an area, or how a space can enhance creativity. And since the world is a complicated place, I not only think about sensory experiences, but I also consider things like our topic for the day, different ways of processing sensory information, as well as topics such as national culture, organizational culture, how they come into play, personality, a number of different factors. So first, I want, when the slide moves forward, you'll see that there we go. There always has to be a glitch. There has to be a glitch. And now we've got it. It's out of the way. So the whole rest of our presentation will flow right along. So first, I'm going to actually cut to the punchline today, give you some idea about how a workplace can actually support people who process sensory information in a variety of different ways. Then we're going to talk about how those different sorts of sensory processing might come to be. And we have to remember that today our focus is on the physical environment, but there are a number of different factors that influence whether people are successful in the workplace. So today, there's really so many details that we'll be talking about that relate to each sort of different sensory processing that you might feel overloaded but quick. But our overall goal is to think about how differences in sensory processing need to be reflected in workplace design, because how we process sensory information, information that we see, hear, etc., how we process that information has a big effect on our professional performance and our well-being. So now we've moved ahead, good. As I said, we'll be covering lots of details today. And I hate to ruin the suspense, but we're going to find that overall, a place that is designed effectively, a workplace that aligns with the peer review research and the best practice out there, is a place where everybody works effectively, regardless of how they process sensory information. So, although there are some real differences between people in how they deal with the signals that their brain receives, no matter what our brains are up to in terms of what we see, hear, smell, etc., a place where everybody will work to their full performance is one that aligns with the different activities that are planned, provides people with choice and environmental control at all different levels. They get to choose where they work, and then they can tune the physical environments that they're in. A space where people work effectively provides them with opportunities for cognitive refreshment. Everybody's brain gets tired. Places where people succeed and where their well-being increases are designed biophysically. They send the right messages non-verbally. They reflect national and organizational cultures. They're green, environmentally responsible, and users know they are. They seem fundamentally familiar to users. They carefully consider standardization and optimization in the environment, and the people who create them understand that perceptions can be much more important than the realities of the actual situation. You know, when we think about these 10 concepts, you realize that they help everybody perform to their full potential because they keep stress levels down for all users. No matter how you approach the world around you, when these 10 things are happening, you will do your best work and live a pleasant life as you do so. So when we're thinking about differences in sensory processing, off the bat, we have to review very quickly how those differences can arise. First of all, not everybody's sensory channels work in exactly the same way. So you can have people who are visually impaired, people who are deaf or have different hearing-related concerns. There's also differential sensory processing. Some of us are more highly sensitive than others. Others of us are on the autism spectrum or have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD for short. We could be dyslexic. Again, all these factors influence how we process the sensory information we take in. Personality comes into play here because there are personality-based differences in responses to environmental stimuli. National culture and even the language we speak matter, and so does the sort of professional training that we have received. Now, all of these different factors I'm talking about can be experienced along a continuum. You can have more or less vision, for example, but we're going to speak pretty broadly today because we don't have much time to go through all of these different concerns. And also, before we go forward, it's important to remember that the people with these variations in sensory processing who are actually in the workplace are people who have no doubt also developed their own ways of accommodating over the years. Another reason to provide environmental control. So first, to kick off the bat, to give you an idea of the information to come, really, we're going to talk about people whose sensory channels don't work quite the same as everybody else's. We're going to talk about people who might be deaf or hard of hearing or have a vision issue, which can include color blindness. And in the United States, at least, about 15% of the population has a hearing issue. And the people at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., have really thought deeply about designing for people who are hard of hearing over the years. Gallaudet happens to be the premier university worldwide for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And the architects who work there, interior designers work there, have compiled the information that they have relating to environments where people who are hard of hearing perform to their full potential and live nice lives. And their codification is something they call deafspace, and they are justly proud of deafspace and have exhibits on their campus, such as the one in the photo, that lay out its principles. Now, I want to talk a little bit about deafspace, so you get an idea of the sorts of things you may need to consider when you're working with people who have differential sensory capabilities. When you're developing a space where that'll be used by people who are hard of hearing, you really have to think a lot about natural light. Like, we're used to thinking about natural light as sort of the best thing ever, right? But if you're reading lips, it can be very challenging to be in a very brightly lit environment. So, especially if there's glare. So you need to think about things as a designer, like putting in clear story windows, using various glass treatments, and also just generally considering soft, diffuse lighting in general with people who might be hard of hearing or deaf. But again, this can work for all of us. If you're reading lips, the space is behind you, behind the head of whoever's lips you are reading, need to be a color that is clearly different than the skin tone of whoever is speaking, so lips can be read. Again, this can help all of us. If you can't hear somebody coming, all sorts of accidents could potentially ensue. So it's great if there are like glass panels on doors that might be open so people can see if others are present. If privacy is an issue, say in a restroom, you can have opaque glass. But again, think about this in the days when everybody is a little distracted by their phone, et cetera, as well as just life in general. This can, having glass panels on doors so we don't get hit by them, can help everybody out. Similarly, if you think about blind intersections, places where two travel routes will come together at right angles, lots of collisions can happen if you can't anticipate that you're going to meet somebody else in that intersection. So rounded corners, having everybody go into like a sort of mini atrium and then on their way, etc. These are all ways that people who are hard of hearing can live better lives, but the rest of us can as well. We also need to think about flexibility in use with people who might be hard of hearing as well as for the rest of us. For example, people who are hard of hearing like to be able to see the faces of whoever they're speaking with, so they like the flexibility to be able to move, reorient furniture a little bit. When people who are hard of hearing are walking and signing, they tend to be a little further apart from each other. So hallways have to be a little wider. But also, when people are signing and walking, if somebody needs to stop signing to open a door, the conversation stops. So automatically opening doors can be really handy. When people are walking and signing, think about walking and signing. They may not be as attentive to the world around them, so it's great to have reminders of things like upcoming stairs and stuff like that, presented by textures underfoot or changes in color in the floor. And in general, when we're thinking about design of hard of hearing, for people who have hard of hearing, we have to really get it into our skulls, really absorb the fact that not everybody who is hard of hearing in exactly the same way. There are variations across this spectrum, like some people just have trouble with echoes, etc., just as there are variations across the population as a whole in all sorts of different conditions. So we always have to be thinking about variability in terms of use. And if you're thinking about today's world, think about accommodating people who are hard of hearing, and then think about hybrid meetings. And you find a lot of what we're talking about in terms of giving people views of others, et cetera, is really relevant in a context you might not have anticipated. Now, the slides for today are going to be available to everybody, so don't worry about copying this down. But all the tenets of deafspace, which again are useful to designers in general and conform to those 10 principles we talked about at the beginning, they're all available at a Gallaudet University website, as shown on this slide. So when we're thinking about people with compromised vision, you'll start to see patterns in what I'm mentioning here. It can be great to have variations in acoustic and tactile experiences that give people who are visually compromised, challenged, some clues as to what's going on. People who have visual issues would prefer to be reminded of changing conditions and things like that through tactile inputs, like bumps in the floor under their feet, than they would through acoustic inputs, but either will work. Again, you're thinking about using the full range of sensory channels to communicate with people who might have issues with one or the other, and that type of communication is handy with people in general. With people who are visually challenged, you need to particularly be concerned about signaling danger situations, like the top of stairs, and the signaling device you provide, like a texture underfoot, has to be clearly and logically linked to danger. So something that's spiky, a little spiky under people's shoes as they walk along, is a great danger signal, as opposed to something that's maybe softer or whatever. There's no logical connection there. When people are have partial vision, you have to think about variations in lighting. Shadows can be very important. You can even communicate through different distinctive patterns of shadows if you choose. And all of these different things that we're talking about always have to be considered at different scales, from desktop to an environment generally. And predictability and familiarity can be your friend at all these different levels as well. They help people who are visually impaired process information because not every detail has to be carefully considered, and this can be handy in workplaces for the rest of us as well. Now, people may be partially sighted, but they also can be colorblind. That can be a really significant issue because lots of important information is communicated in our environment via color. We draw people's attention to various parts of a space via color. We may send some sort of signal about what needs to be attended to because of danger or whatever via color. And those of us who have full color vision can be really challenged for designing, but for the visually impaired, for the colorblind, but there are all sorts of tools and things like Photoshop that will translate something that you've created into what would be viewed by someone with different sorts of color blindness. So there's all sorts of tools on the web that you can use to better understand how somebody who is colorblind will experience an environment that you've created. People can also be highly sensitive to the environment. And this is interesting because people who are highly sensitive will respond more significantly to both negative aspects of the environment, like distractions, as well as positive ones, like plants in the workplace. So the responses are more dramatic in either direction. And any sort of sense can be involved here, and visual, audio, olfactory, etc. And so in workplaces, if you're thinking about supporting these sorts of individuals, you really get into thinking about something like this just went out, shelter pods that might have acoustic, visual, or olfactory shielding. But these spaces actually can be used by anybody in a work environment productively at different times, depending on whatever tasks they're engaged in. And when these sorts of pods are available to an entire workforce, stigma from use is eliminated. Now, recently, being somewhere on the autism spectrum and participating in the workplace has been getting a lot of attention. And this makes sense because more and more people with autism are in the workplace because they have very special proclivities, shall we say, that make them very handy in certain sorts of jobs. For example, they're really good at recognizing patterns and working with really complex systems. But when people are on the autism spectrum, how they communicate and interact with the world around them is affected. And we need to make the point that people who are autistic, any one of their sensory channels can be influenced, and along any one of those channels, they can be made either more sensitive or less sensitive. So I could be very sensitive to visual stimuli and not as sensitive as other people generally are to acoustic stimuli. So you have a really complex situation here. But when we're thinking about creating spaces for people who are autistic, we can bear certain principles in mind. And if you are interested in how people who are autistic experience the world around you, if you Google it, you'll find that there's lots of comparative images online of how somebody who is on the spectrum would see a space and how somebody who's not on the spectrum would see the same place. Often those differences relate to things like the significance of glare. And natural light is the first thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of people who are autistic in the physical environment. You know, too much of even a good thing is too much. And, you know, even for people who process sensory information the same way everybody else does, there can be a space with too much natural light. For example, you can have issues with glare. But people on the autism spectrum are particularly sensitive to glare and contrasts in lighting. So generally having slightly dimmer lighting, blinds, clear story windows, and more diffused indirect lighting can be really handy. With a autistic population, you have to be really concerned about how much is going on visually in an environment, how much visual clutter is present, and you can deal with that with things like storage, tools, etc. You have to be particularly concerned about audio distractions as well as visual ones. And it's very important to keep the sound in one area from flowing into another and using whatever absorbent materials, et cetera, are available. And the absorbent materials, particularly if they're creating soft surfaces, can be doubly handy because they can prevent physical injury by people who walk into something like a sharp table corner. You also have to think about things like compulsive behaviors when you're creating spaces for people who are on the autism spectrum, sometimes people who are autistic. And remember, there's a huge range of situations, you know, among people who are on the autism spectrum. But some people who are autistic will compulsively count something like the number of swans in a certain pattern. They may engage in some sort of repetitive behavior, like hitting the same spot over and over again. And you have to try to think about those sorts of potentialities for compulsive behavior when you're creating a space for people who are autistic. People who are autistic can have trouble with wayfinding, so you need the floor plans of spaces to be pretty straightforward, but that can help all of us. Also, creating zones for different activities can help for people who are autistic. This can help us in general because you can tailor a space for particularly exactly what will happen there. But with people who are autistic, zoning and specializing, creating specialized spaces helps people develop routines, and routines and maintaining them are very important in the lives of autistic individuals. We also should remember that people on the spectrum can have trouble with really very open places. They prefer familiar types of settings. They generally dislike novelty in an environment, but again, that can help all of us because any of us can be impaired when we're trying to figure out what's going on in a space. And people who are autistic tend to prefer more rectilinear and not as many curvilinear elements in a space. And designing for people who are autistic is really complicated. Here are two resources that are available to all, free online, that you can access to get many more details that I wasn't able to cover. The first, it relates to specifically to designing places for adults with ADHD, with autism, and the second is relevant to people of all ages with autism. Next, we're going to talk very briefly about people with ADHD. And in the US, at least, this is about a little over 4% of the adults seem to have ADHD. And it's characterized by generally being, at least from time to time, inattentive, hyperactive, or impulsive. But people who are ADHD are also very quick to respond to environmental stimuli and may have a higher level of creativity than the rest of us. So it may seem that the best thing you can do to design for people with ADHD is basically like put them in a box, right? But you have to know that with people with ADHD, just like people in the population in general, too much going on in the world around them can be distracting, but so can too little going on in the world around them. So you have to, as with people in general, hit a really sweet spot in the middle. So when we're talking about designing for people with ADHD, we have to be very attuned to potential distractions of all different sorts in the physical environment. And distractions really can take so many different forms. For example, a temperature. You know, if a space tends to be too hot or too cold, this can be really terrible for somebody with ADHD. But actually, it distracts and stresses the rest of us out too. But somebody who's ADHD can get totally absorbed in dealing with that temperature issue, like trying to figure out how to set the temperature, reset it, recalibrate things, etc. So when you're thinking about distractions, my point is you have to think very generally. With people with ADHD, it's also really handy to think about providing various sorts of organizational aids, cabinets, drawers, etc., that people can't see into. If you give people a drawer or storage box that's transparent on all sides, you haven't really rid them of the distraction. You also, again, with people with ADHD, have to really think about visual complexity and toning things back, having a fewer colors, patterns, etc., than you might otherwise in a space. This will help them perform to their full potential. It is true that work surface lighting on exactly what needs to be focused on, really can help people with ADHD, and so can cooler colored as opposed to warmer colored light. But in general, the research shows that when we're experiencing cooler light, everybody has more ease concentrating, for example. People with ADHD do particularly well also when they're in a space with white noise or some sort of similar sound masking system. And also, they respond particularly well to being in areas with access to nature and green spaces. Next, we're going to talk very briefly about dyslexia. People who are dyslexic have difficulty processing and remembering information they see and that they hear, but in a way to somewhat balance this concern, they generally have enhanced visual spatial capabilities and can be particularly good at resolving problems thinking in 3 dimensions. Now, people with dyslexia in the workplace, at least in this day and age, often have been in learning environments with various sorts of accommodations to support them, and they generally anticipate that these sorts of accommodations will continue to be present in workplaces that they enter. So it's very important for you to keep up with how local universities are supporting people who are dyslexic, for example. Sometimes people have developed their own ways of supporting themselves, you wouldn't be able to anticipate those. But if you have a variety of work environments, some with more visual and acoustic privacy than others, people who are dyslexic will probably be able to identify an area where they can do whatever it is they need to do to perform to their full potential. People with dyslexia can have problems with wayfinding. So again, good signage, which helps us all, is handy. Often, people who are dyslexic, we have some organizational issues, so providing organizational tools can help. And it's important to remember that feeling stressed not only exacerbates ADHD-related concerns, but really degrades our cognitive performance no matter how we process sensory information. So it's very important for all of us to create a physical environment where the lights don't do some weird thing that stresses people out, or there isn't a funny sound, or that kind of thing. Environmental stresses are not good for any of us. Next, we're going to talk about personality and how it affects sensory processing. Personality is a fascinating topic. We're all really interested in other people. It's something inherent in being a human. Unfortunately, today we only have a couple of minutes to talk about how personality influences how people process sensory information. But this is a really cool topic to think about. We're going to be reviewing personality based on something that's called the Big Five personality system. And the Big Five identifies the factors that you're probably familiar with, things like extroversion, introversion, openness to experience, which I'm going to be defining each of these in a moment, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which has an unfortunate name. We generally call it emotional stability now because the word neurotic has developed all sorts of undesirable associations. But if you think about extroversion, introversion, extroverts get a lot of energy from the world around them. They're more oriented outward. Introverts get a bigger push energy-wise from things that are going on in their own head. It makes them, they're more inwardly focused. People who are conscientious are more attuned to things such as organization. So just as an environment for people who are extroverts may encourage social contact, an environment for people who are conscientious might make it very straightforward to be clean, neat, up-to-date, and tidy. Openness to experience is really how receptive you are to novelty, things that are non-traditional. And agreeableness relates to how you interact with those around you, how accommodating you are to those individuals. And as I said, neuroticism relates to emotional stability. So the most frequently researched aspect of personality as it relates to place is extroversion and introversion. And what it really boils down to is people who are extroverted will do their, will prefer and will perform better in an environment that's got more going on, while people who are introverted will perform at a higher level in a more carefully curated space. So I have to show you this picture. I was in Milan, I guess about 3 weeks ago now, and I walked by the showroom for Dolce & Gabbana's home design studio. And this was what you could see in the store. I photographed this in the street. I'm very extroverted. I love this. It has the fully saturated colors that people like me are apt to prefer, lots of patterns, lots of stuff going on. I love this. But I also know that if I put my introverted husband into this environment, he would he'd be really upset. This is too much. It would be too much going on from a sensory visual perspective for him. And this is at the root of what we're talking about. We're talking about tuning a workplace designed for personality. Like, nobody would actually perform to their full potential in a place with this much going on visually. I like it, but even for me, this would be too much. But this is the key factor with extroversion and introversion, is tuning the amount of information people are going to get from the physical world around them, how energizing the environment is in terms of colors, scents, and things like that. Tuning to whether somebody is relatively more extroverted or relatively more introverted. And, this all has some logical extensions, like for extroversion and introversion, as I'm talking about. Right now, research has shown that introverts are generally be pretty enthusiastic, shall we say, about private offices, and they're much less enthused about open plan, agile working, and hot desking type alternatives. Again, because we're talking about amount of information that they're receiving. People who are open to experience will favor novel experiences in design to an extent that people who are not will not. People who are low on openness prefer more traditional sorts of environments. People who are conscientious like a space that's well-ordered, clean, and has also some organizational aids, and that's where they will do their best work. They're stressed otherwise. Agreeableness is really interesting from a design perspective. People who are more agreeable tend to be they tend to be less materialistic than others. They also are more interested in sort of representational art, like impressionist type art than others. People who are less emotionally stable, more neurotic, respond really adversely to environmental stress. They prefer larger personal spaces. They can be much more concerned about eye contact and really need opportunities to gracefully break eye contact whenever possible. And they can also be refreshed by being in looking at urban landscapes that don't refresh people who are not so neurotic. So again, just to give you some of the ideas of differences out there. Now, in the couple minutes we have left, I want to talk to you about some factors that maybe you haven't considered as much. Our national culture, where we were born and lived when we were young, as well as the language we're speaking, has a really significant influence on how we experience the world around us, how we pull in sensory information, and what we do with it once we get it. So, I took this picture on a vacation in Hawaii once, and if you ever have trouble reaching me, look for this space on Maui, because this is where I will be. To me, this is quite idyllic, but off topic. There's been a lot of research that shows that where you were born and spent the early years of your life has a big effect on on what you tend to actually focus on in the world around you. So people like me who are raised in the West, when we look at a picture like this, we go right to the focal element. We could think of that here as like the gazebo. And we really pay attention to that focal element. We learn everything about it. Like after I looked at this picture for just a minute or so, I could probably tell you everything about that gazebo, like what the roof is shaped like and things like that. but I wouldn't know anything really about the world around it. You know, someone from the West really goes to that focal point. Now, somebody who's raised in the Near East or Far East will attend to the whole scene more generally. So they will know something about that gazebo, but they'll also know something about the trees and stuff around it. So how would this come into play? Since it's early morning here and I've just had breakfast, maybe I'll use that kitchen example here. If you were designing, but the points I'm making would be relevant to any workplace. If you were designing like a kitchen for people from who were raised in the West, you'd really want to pay a lot of attention to what like the refrigerator is like and what the stove is like. That's what we would look at when we go into the kitchen and form our initial impression, which would be lasting. Now, if you're thinking that you'll be selling a home or whatever to people from the Far East, you need to pay obviously some attention to that refrigerator and the stove or whatever, but you also have to think about things like the backsplash and what's on the walls and stuff, because people from the Far East will attend to that, where a lot of it's lost on me when I'm making my initial decision about the space. I also want to very briefly mention the fact that the language that you're speaking has a big effect on how you process sensory information. And particularly important is the language that you spoke first when you were learning to speak. And some languages have genders associated with nouns, and some don't. And there was some really interesting research done at Stanford. People who grew up in different parts of the world speaking different languages were interviewed, and all the research I'm about to tell you about took place in English, where there are very few gendered nouns. One of the few that's left is ship. Ships are often viewed as female in English, but there aren't very many gendered nouns in English. So anyway, it turns out that, let me just give you a specific example because that makes it all much more concrete, much faster. In some languages, the word bridge is masculine. In other languages, the word bridge is feminine. Now, what they found out working with the word bridge is true for all gendered nouns. When people think about the gender, think about a noun, and if it was gendered when in the language they first spoke, they want the design generally to align with the stereotypes for the gender in place. So if you grew up thinking, speaking a language where the word bridge is a masculine word, you think a good bridge is like sturdy, strong, etc. While people who grow up in places where the word bridge is feminine, expect a bridge to be more graceful, etc. So, you know, this stuff that you learned when you were just learning language continues to influence how you process sensory information for the rest of your life. So, like if you're ever having a conversation with somebody and they say something like, that chair just isn't right, and you're looking at it like, can you, and you're really asking like, can you really help me understand how it's not right? If you probe what language they first spoke, if you can get around to that, you might get the answer to your question, because perhaps they're pointing at a chair that has lots of really graceful curving lines, but they grew up speaking a language where the word chair is masculine. So again, you know, this can help you get to the root of some significant issues. Also, different languages have different ways of talking about color, and those ways of speaking about color determine things like how people can differentiate between different shades. For example, in Russian, there's a completely different word for light blue and dark blue, and people who speak Russian first are very quick to differentiate between shades of blue. They do this in ways that those of us who just talk about different kinds of blue by adding an adjective in front, we just don't do that. Also, different languages divide up colors in different ways. For example, historically in Japan, the same sorts of words were used for blue and green. And traffic lights in Japan are often a turquoise color, a sort of intermediate color that isn't true in the rest of the world. Now, finally, we're going to talk about expertise. This influences how people experience space. With training, you learn to look for differences in environments that people without training just don't attend to. As you learn to look for these differences, you become more familiar with them, more receptive to them, have more positive feelings about them. So, someone who's spent their life thinking about color will prefer shades different than the population as a whole. So then, to conclude, we've learned that there's lots of differences between how people can process sensory information, but if we take the steps outlined in this list, by doing things like aligning places with the task at hand, giving people control, flexibility to work in different sorts of environments, to customize environments to their own needs, etc. These points on the list, that we can support everyone in a space, and everyone there can work to their full potential, and their well-being is increased. If you're wondering what's the single most important thing for you to attend to in a physical environment, it's sound. Those of us who are neurotypical, as well as those who have issues, tend to be quite attuned to sound-related issues in a space. So if you can only focus on one thing, that's what you need to focus on. But again, don't get really concerned about all these details about how people with different ways of processing sensory information do just that. If you create a workplace that aligns with the principles of good design that you've learned and known for years, you'll create a place where everybody works to their full potential and lives a nice life as they do so. So I'll be happy to answer questions, and also don't worry about the materials noted in the slides. The references, the resources, the slide deck is going to be available to all. So I don't know what questions are out there. What are people asking, Mark?
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for a great array of questions. And I think you answered one of them to the end. If people had to think about one or two of those, because it felt quite overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, that's why it is quite overwhelming.
Can you go back to say which was the couple of priorities that you would? The slides aren't being shared.
Yeah. Okay. So if I was going to prioritize, as I said, first I'd go with what it sounds like, because in a space, because a lot of the things that we've talked about, specifically, for instance, people being in the autism spectrum, people with ADHD, highly sensitive people, etc., they can often be very attuned to sound issues, but sound also matters a lot to the rest of us. Because of the kind of animal we are, we just can't ignore sounds around us that might relate to anything that matters in our life. So thinking about sound from not only a purely physical, mechanical perspective, like how many decibels, but also from a psychological perspective, really matters. For example, people can be a lot more accepting of sounds if they think they're justified, for example. So, if people think a conversation nearby has to happen, particular time and place, they might be less distracted by it than they would be otherwise. So first, I think about sound. Second, I would think about visual complexity. You're generally trying to have about as many colors, patterns, as much order, whatever, in an environment as would be found in a residential environment designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Residential environments by Frank Lloyd Wright have moderate visual complexity. That's usually the goal. But in a workplace where there's a lot going on, where people are under stress, sometimes if you tune that back a little bit, it'll help people with autism, people with ADHD, and probably the user population as a whole.
Great, thank you. Is there a method of quantifying the amount of neurodiversity one takes into consideration, or does it go back to what you said, good design will be inclusive?
Well, a good design is inclusive. When you get into doing research in this field, first of all, you find it's hard to even quantify how many individuals are in the various sorts of situations I described. Even something that's you would think would be really straightforward, like how many people are blind in a country, that can be hard to quantify. So just to get an idea of the raw numbers of individuals affected can be challenging. And then to think about where they're likely to be in a workplace is also a challenge, but it does help us to remember that people who are similar psychologically tend to do similar jobs. You see this particularly with personality, like salespeople as a group really are extroverted, for example. So if you see an individual with a certain issue among a group of workers, probably there are others with that same challenge, or there will be others in the future with that challenge. So you would have to be particularly concerned about designing for autism or whatever with that particular group.
Thank you. Interesting question here. Is there anything you advise someone who can actually impact their own space if they feel they're neurodiverse? So some people suggest noise cancelling headphones, but there are other tips that someone can do to their own space rather than...
I think everybody knows themselves best. And as I said at the beginning, all of these various situations I'm talking about are along a continuum. Some people might need noise cancellation headphones, like some people with ADHD might need noise cancellation headphones, but other people who are also diagnosed, with ADHD, they might not need the same headphones. So think about yourself, what has worked for you, and then think about how that could be brought up to a bigger scale. And this is why I'm always encouraging people creating workplaces to create a range of different settings, and then give people some control, reasonable amounts of control within those settings, so people can select, to write the report in the area of the workplace where they will write that report most effectively. So give people options and then control within the options presented.
Thank you. There was a couple of questions about the picture of the box that you showed, and you were talking, sort of allegorically about not putting people in the box. But what was that box?
Oh, yeah, that box actually, it happens to be at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and it's a space with a door, that closes and all. It's soundproofed, and you can rent it, I think it's in 10-minute increments, and do things like focused work there while you're waiting for your plane, maybe have a Zoom call there while you're waiting for your plane, etc. So yeah, it's a workplace in an airport.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
That's been an excellent session, and we will be following up afterwards with the event with a follow-up email with lots of links. I'm going to add a lot of the links in the follow-up email that are on, and on the slide deck. I've also added a link in the chat box for our next webinars. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll also send a link to the recording where you can watch it again and share it. So lots of people saying thank you. So thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, have a good day.